Well, I wrote you after reading the autobiography, which I thought was excellent, and I had no idea that there were people who had given some negative reviews. In fact, I don't think anybody really criticized the autobiography, did they? They only really criticized your lifestyle or your choices of life or your opinions.
I suppose. You see, when people started attacking me soon after The Outsider came out, it was this sort of feeling of, this young man became famous too easily, and therefore there was a certain kind of personal animus there. When the autobiography came out, I thought, I've expressed myself so clearly in this, everything that I believe and so on, the book is bound to make an impact. And so I was puzzled and upset when the two major reviews that had launched The Outsider in the 2 Sundays were both pretty vicious. And I thought, my God, the buggers are still around.
Well, I think what is interesting is that in fact, nobody did criticize the book. And I think possibly these attacks, would you say that it's possibly due to the fact that you have chosen to be an outsider? You're rejecting literary London, and you're rejecting to some extent, academia, the philosophical mainstream.
I suspect that my sheer cheerfulness irritates people. The peak experiences are undoubtedly the moments when you suddenly feel that you're doing what you ought to be doing. Csikszentmihalyi called it the flow experience.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And this is indeed exactly what happens. Quite suddenly your energies are flowing properly in the right direction. Maslow interested me very much because he was the psychologist who wrote to me from America around about 1960 and sent me some of his papers. What he said was that as a psychologist, he'd got utterly bored with studying sick people because sick people just talked about their sickness. And so he decided that he would try studying the healthiest people he could find, and made a discovery that no one had ever made before. That is, that all of these people had with great frequency what he called peak experiences. They were just sudden terrific bubbling experiences of sheer happiness. He said, and for example, a mother was watching her husband and kids eating breakfast when suddenly a beam of sunlight came in through the window, and he thought, my God, aren't I lucky? And she thought rather, and went into the peak experience. And as to Osborne, of course, with Look Back in Anger, which I must say I hated, this whole thing, a play of a chap who spends all his time attacking his wife and being nasty to her. I wanted to get up and walk out of the theatre within the first half hour. I didn't because some friend has taken us along there. But I kept identifying the girl on stage with Joy who was sitting there at the side of me. And so I hated it. I got called an angry young man simply because Osborne's play went on 2 weeks before The Outsider came out. So we naturally got lumped together. And at first the press weren't sure whether to call us outsiders, this new generation, or angry young men. But angry young men sort of was more catchy. And so that's what it became. But of course I never was angry.
Was it something you had to kind of live down over the years? The way a rock musician has his first album that comes out and he's forever been pinned to, labeled with that. Was it something you had to make an effort to live down?
And The Outsider, no, because all my work is based on The Outsider. I've really only written one book. All of my work, is all together.
Yeah.
And so, from the beginning, there was something I wanted to say, and gradually what I wanted to say, I've developed. But in fact, when I reread The Outsider, as I did the other day, because a new impression of the paperback is just out.
Oh, really?
I thought, my God, this is really bloody good.
Lawrence, of course, had this tragic ending as well, didn't he? T.E. Lawrence, although it was, I suppose, just an accident.
Oh, yeah, no, this was an accident, but it was partly the fact that Lawrence himself had got himself into this state of sort of savage depression about the civilization and what we'd done to the Arabs at the end of the First World War and the way that we'd betrayed them. But Lawrence's problem was, once again, self-doubt. You can see that I feel that there's nothing quite as deadly as this self-doubt that's killed off so many of the romantics throughout the 19th century, and that now seems, set to do the same thing in the 20th century. Somehow, the whole thing has got to be turned back. This pessimism which really started with 19th century Romanticism and then went on with Camus and Sartre and so on, has been lying across the path of civilization like some enormous fallen tree, and we've got to get a bulldozer and move it.
We're surrounded by 30,000 books in this home, and I love reading, and many of your theories come out of reading. But I think there is a question of where do you draw the line and say, you know, enough is enough for the imaginary world. We must deal with the world outside of books. I think it comes up with things like video games for kids these days as well, in the sense that the kids become, their reality becomes the reality of the video game. And in a sense, it's similar with a book. Now, obviously, a book is representing something that is lived or imagined to be lived. But where do you consciously think of that yourself, about the two different realities?
Well, don't you see that in a sense is what I've been writing about all my life, because the starting point of The Outsider was the way that this started to happen in the 19th century with Romanticism and with people living that other life by somebody curling up in a window seat and becoming Pamela for the whole day. So suddenly you've got people capable of living a kind of second life, quite apart from their ordinary everyday life. But what was worse is that living that second life actually meant that they didn't like coming back to the real world. They found it quite a shock. That is why you've got such a high suicide rate among the romantics of the 19th century. They just found the real world pretty unbearable. I realized that it was my problem too, because here in my teens, I much preferred the works of Edgar Allan Poe and E.T.A. Hoffmann and various romantics to the actual world in which I had to work and live. What I realized little by little was that I have to learn to deal with the real world and have to develop a certain kind of force to deal with that world. Now, what I've been talking about, this ability to really concentrate and so on, is the kind of thing that you have to learn in order to cope. So it's really quite a problem of all these kids. What they're doing is the equivalent of what the Romantics did in the 19th century. Mm-hmm. And of course it's going to unman them as far as living real life is concerned. Mm-hmm. And somehow what we have to do is to persuade them to sort of get back to the real world and recognize that, oddly enough, the real world, far from being a horrifying sort of place that has no relation to your deepest inner feelings, is somehow quite closely connected with it. You can actually change your life by wanting something. When H.G. Wells said that in the history of Mr. Polly, if you don't like your life, you can change it, I can remember a kind of tingle going through my hair when I first read that. And it seemed to me that, that was wonderful, because there I was, a teenager, hating my life, living in this working class background in Leicester, and the belief that if you don't like your life, you can change it, made a huge difference.
Do you have any sort of last feelings of things that you haven't really quite succeeded at getting across, that you still want to? Well, you've just said a little bit, but how well do you think you have succeeded in, this far in expressing exactly what you want to?
If you look at the bloody English, not at all. But on the other hand, clearly there are more people who understand what I'm talking about than I expected. I realized that the Japanese were translating all my books and that I was making more money from Japan than I was making from the English-speaking countries. And this is simply because you've got a mindset that is fairly close to mine. And that is to say that they're capable of sort of really seeing the relation between philosophy and life and getting quite excited about it, whereas the English never do.
You've got two sons and a daughter, and Joy. And what has the family life provided you that was necessary for your writing or for your well-being?
Well, when I started out as a writer, it didn't seem to me that I'd ever be anything else except an outsider, and that in point of fact I'd probably go on living and working alone. My first novel, Ritual in the Dark, with its central character Gerard Somme living alone in a room in Camden Town, this is how I saw myself. I couldn't imagine things really changing. I had been married, but it hadn't worked out. It had lasted 18 months. Then I met Joy, and we settled down here in the country and had children. And of course, quite suddenly, if you have kids, they become the most important thing in your world. And having this anchor, this family, meant that in spite of the fact that so many of my books have been pretty violently attacked, I've always managed to carry on. And I went through a period, which I describe in the autobiography, of panic attacks when I really felt, that my sanity was right on the edge. And still managed to fight my way through that, rather than sort of, having a nervous breakdown. Simply because I've got a family to look after, and I couldn't afford to give way and groan. And so I feel that, 30 years on from these problems, we started in the early 1970s, nearly 40 years on, they were, in fact, one of the major learning experiences of my life. I've got a feeling, you see, that everyone could do all kinds of interesting things if they recognize the fact that human beings possess all kinds of unseen, unknown powers, and that they're really like four-engined aeroplanes which have got used to flying on one engine and forgotten that they've got the three extra.
It has now been 4 years since Colin Wilson died on the 5th of December 2013. He had always wanted to live, said he would, until he was 100 years old. I thought he just might make it, given his thirst for life and his optimistic philosophy. The interview you just saw, excerpts of it, was performed not long after the publication of Philosopher of Optimism, my interview book with Wilson, which itself was based on a similar interview done in 2005. With the anniversary of his death, with the years passing, it seemed to me like it was the right moment to come up with a new edition of the book, for which I have written a preface in which I talk about how Wilson's philosophy and the book itself helped me through an extremely difficult time in my own life. And hopefully shortly we will be putting out the full-length film of the interview. What was better, the book or the interview? The way I see it, they're both Colin Wilson talking about his extraordinary philosophy, and that makes them equally as good.